The first thing you should do when you start learning Japanese is you should learn the Japanese kana. The kana are two different alphabets that represent the different phonetic sounds in Japanese. The names of those are the hiragana and the katakana. You can learn more about those in other videos I've done, but the basic idea here is that you're basically hamstringing yourself if you're using Roman characters to learn Japanese in the beginning, because there's so many sounds we have in English and in other Romance languages that did not exist in Japanese ever and still do not exist in Japanese. So you'll end up using those sounds when you're speaking Japanese, even though they don't exist. So this is how I started learning kana 13 years ago in 2012 when I started learning Japanese. I used a book by James Hasig called Remembering the Kana, and it basically used little mnemonic stories to help you remember each one of the hiragana first. You'd go through all the hiragana, learn those, and then it would use different stories to learn all of the katakana, and those would be learned later. I found that his book was great for learning the hiragana at the time, but it was lacking when it came to katakana. So for katakana, I ended up using a game called LRNJ. And it was basically a little like Final Fantasy, like original Final Fantasy 1-2 style RPG, where you basically fought monsters that were based on the different katakana. And you had to type in the reading for the katakana as you went along. And then I would just write each katakana out while saying the sound over and over again. And that worked pretty well. But as I've mentioned in other videos like this, I think it's better to learn the hiragana and katakana together as pairs. You can kind of think of them as upper and lowercase letters, and if you do that, it's much easier to remember the katakana, which are a little less frequently used. I talk about why in other videos, but basically katakana are generally harder for new learners. And if you learn them as pairs with hiragana, it makes them easier to remember. So I generally recommend learning them as pairs. There aren't many resources out there that do that, so I made a video, The Ultimate Guide to Japanese Kana, that will teach you all of the kana. It gives you stories and practice on how to learn them, and that can be really, really helpful. Now, usually I like to share alternate resources, like ones that I didn't make, but sometimes there aren't alternate resources, which is why I made what I made. In this case, the Ultimate Guide to Japanese Kana video, I made that because I couldn't find anything that was basically teaching kana the way that I recommended that they be taught. So I did it myself, and I think that video is the best video on the internet for learning the kana, so check that out if you're interested in getting started. If you do that, you will be off to a great start and be ready to jump into learning some grammar. Now, when I started learning grammar in 2012, I picked up a handy little book called A Dictionary of Basic Japanese Grammar, created by the Japan Times. And I just started going from like A to Z through all of the grammar points, reading about them, and then making my own example sentences using those grammar points. Then I'd meet up with a teacher on Skype, and she would correct all my sentences. Usually they were all completely wrong, and she'd give me better sentences. And then I threw them in a flashcard deck, and I would review those over time. I would probably not do that now, though, because what happened was I was covering lots of grammar that really wasn't necessary at a beginning level, and because the grammar dictionary doesn't necessarily tell you whether a grammar is commonly used or in what kind of situations it might be common and in what situations another grammar might fit the bill better, I ended up having some sort of weird Japanese quirks, and teachers, various teachers on Skype at the time, were telling me, you probably need to go back to the basics because you're missing a lot of stuff and you're talking kind of weird. So what I did was I ended up having to go back to a textbook. And just based on my experience throughout all that, I think that it's probably a good idea to just pick up one of the most popular textbooks out there. For example, Genki or Tobita or something like that, and just getting the basics down for grammar right away. I actually did a whole entire series where I covered all of the Genki textbooks, which go from the Japanese Language Proficiency Test N5, that's the lowest level, up into the next level. We cover all of that grammar in that video series. That's done very well here on YouTube. I think it can be very helpful if you want to check that out. You can also just go through the textbook yourself or learn it with a teacher on Skype or whatever, take a class somewhere. Just get those basics down and you're going to be off to a great start. Personally, I would prefer if the textbook started you out with informal Japanese because it's much easier to learn formal Japanese later if you have the basics of informal Japanese, because most informal Japanese is based on just like dictionary forms, which means when you search for a verb, for example, you're going to get a dictionary form, and informal Japanese is usually based around that. And then there's very simple rules where you take that informal Japanese and convert it, so to speak, into formal Japanese. And it's much easier if you have the informal Japanese first. But most textbooks teach you the formal Japanese first and then move up into informal Japanese, which can be very confusing, but it's still good to get those basics down. If you want an alternative, you can check out ToKiniAndy.com, our website, where I actually created a new sort of flow for teaching vocabulary and grammar together. And I teach a lot of informal stuff first in a flow that I think is a little bit more, makes a little bit more sense. But you can also just use a normal textbook, a YouTube series, or something like that to help you get the basics down. So I have one secret that gave me a really big advantage in learning Japanese, which we'll get to at the end of this video. But don't worry, I'm gonna give you some tips that will help you basically have the same advantage without having the big advantage that I had. The next step, of course, step 3, vocabulary. Vocabulary is, of course, very important. If you don't have vocabulary, you can't speak at all. What I did in 2012 is I used Anki SRS. There are some fake Anki apps out there on the iOS and Google stores, so be careful. I'll show you the ones that are fake. Here's the real one. You want to make sure you're using that if you're going to use Anki these days. I was using that way back in the day, way back in 2012. That was already out. SRS, it means Spaced Repetition System. And that means that there's an algorithm that basically estimates when you're about to forget something, like a vocabulary word or something, and then it shows it to you when you're about to forget it so that you don't forget it. And it works really, really well. In the beginning, you probably, even if you don't really like flashcards, you should probably use it because it's going to make your life easier in the long run. So I made flashcards. I was basically downloading shared decks off of Anki's shared deck page. And I was creating some personal decks, just putting in words I knew along the way, just the word and the meaning on the back. And this helped me really build habits. I was also using Anki for learning kanji, which we'll talk about later. But just having flashcards to go through every day, you know, it would pop up the reviews I had to do that day because I was about to forget the words, and I do that every single day. And that little bit of practice every day helped me build habits for studying Japanese, which is very important in the beginning as well. The issue was that a lot of the shared decks are just not very well made. A lot of them have mistakes, and most of them are just, well, even the ones with sentences, the sentences were often too difficult or just, I don't know, they weren't great. So, yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind. So what I would do now in 2025 is I would pick either a 2K or 6K deck, which that means they have the most common 2,000 or 6,000 words in the language. They usually have sentences and audio, and that helps a lot. Or a JLPT level divided deck that also has example sentences. That's very, very important. The issue, of course, is that most shared stuff out there doesn't have, how should I call it? Not necessarily super simple sentences. Like you might be getting a bunch of words that you don't know yet in your example sentences. And that's natural because it's very time consuming to make what's called N+1 cards. N+1 cards are vocabulary cards with sentences that only have one new word for you. Like, you know, all the words in the sentence, all the grammar, except for the one new word. And those are very, very time consuming to make. And I know because I've made them, a lot of them. Me and my wife, Yuki, we created an N5 deck for our website. And it takes a long time, a lot of effort. Worth it though, because you can go through new sentences and new cards and you know everything around it except for the new word. So it means a lot of words you can pick up just from the context of the sentence, or at the very least, you get to see a brand new word in a context you understand. So it makes it easier to understand. So if you can find an N+1 deck for you to get started with learning, that will be very helpful. If you make a deck with N+1, that would be good too, except that you probably don't know Japanese well enough yet to create that yourself. So probably trying to find one that is already made would be helpful. I, of course, have already made one on ToKiniAndy.com, so you're welcome to check that out. I hate pushing my stuff so much, but it's just that I wish these things existed when I started studying Japanese, which is why I keep making them. So, like, I have to recommend them because I made them because I think they're useful. If you can find another one that's similar to this, please share it down in the comments. I haven't been able to find a whole lot, which is why I made one. The next step, very important, is you're gonna have to learn kanji. Not everyone likes kanji. Kanji are Chinese characters. That's what they're called. That's what the name kanji means, Chinese characters that were borrowed to represent Japanese words. Kanji generally have a meaning, but they can also be, they're read in a certain way. They have a phonetic reading as well. Now, one kanji can have multiple phonetic readings based depending on what word it's in. You don't have to worry about that too much right now. Just know that kanji are a very important part of Japanese and you're never going to be able to get away from them. So I do recommend learning them. It makes life a lot easier down the road. So you want to get started early. What I did in 2012 is I used James Hasig. You've already heard that name. Remembering the Kanji was the name of his book. And you basically learn a single English meaning that you attach to the kanji for 2,200 kanji. And that's it. Then you learn how to write them, and you use like mnemonics, stories, to help you remember that single meaning to attach to that kanji. So you can basically see a word with 2 kanji in it or something and get the idea of what the meaning is, even though you can't phonetically read it. And the problem with that is you couldn't phonetically read it. Even after spending 6 months finishing that book, which is about what it takes, even if you spend quite a bit of time on it every day, I couldn't read any Japanese. So what I do in 2025 is a little bit different, a little bit of the same, a little bit different. Now what I do is I would divide different kanji into their JLPT, which is Japanese language proficiency test levels, or their Kanken levels, which is the Japanese kanji test that native Japanese kids take, or adults as well, because there's some very high levels. So you divide the kanji into those levels because you'll find books for like kids generally only have kanji from those levels. So as you're starting to read more native material in the future, if you know those levels at least, your life will be a lot easier. So I would divide kanji into those levels. RTK did not divide kanji up into whether they were like the most useful or not. You just learn them in an order based on their parts, their different parts. And that's very helpful, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to read anything even after spending 6 months on those. So I divide the kanji up into those kind of levels so that you could really get into reading stuff pretty early on. And then after I learned a single meaning for each kanji, just like RTK, for a single level, so only like 100 kanji or so, I would then start learning words that contain those kanji. And I learned those words in the context of sentences because I think that is a very good way to start learning to read the kanji. You can learn the individual readings, the phonetic readings for each kanji, but some kanji have like 30 different phonetic readings. So it's really not efficient or really honestly helpful because even if you learn all 30 phonetic readings for a single kanji, it doesn't mean you're going to know which one belongs to which word. So basically, after you learn the kanji and what they mean and how to write them, I do recommend writing because writing has been shown in various different studies, even in China, of kids learning Chinese characters, that those who actually wrote the kanji when they learned them memorize them much easier. If you learn words, which usually have between 1 and 4 kanji in them, then you don't have to worry about how to read each individual kanji in the word. You just know the word and what kanji are associated with it. So it makes it easier. We do have our own deck and our own YouTube series, which is free. You can check out the YouTube series where I start teaching this way. It's not complete. We've only done the first level. Although when this video comes out, the second level might be available. So we currently have taught 118 kanji and all their parts and all the words for them. And there's going to be a couple hundred more coming soon. So you could check that out. There's alternatives like Wanikani sort of does this approach. They teach just like RTK, and then they teach you one reading, I believe. And then you learn words separately down the road. So that is one other option. A lot of people like Kodansha's kanji course, I believe it's called. And it does not teach the way that I recommend, but a lot of people still like it. So those are some alternatives. Listening, of course, is also a very important part of studying Japanese, learning to actually understand what you're hearing. If you can't do that, you're going to have some trouble. What I did back in 2012 was I actually watched a lot of Japanese dramas. Not a lot, but like after work each day, I'd watch 1 or 2 episodes of a show called Aibo, which is a detective show following an old detective around Japan. It was very interesting. I didn't look up anything that I didn't understand as I was watching. I just watched it sort of passively, and I started to pick little things up, and it was fun. It helped me get used to the sounds of Japanese and things like that. At the time, I also watched Naruto, and what I was doing, I'd never been interested in anime before that, but what I was doing with it is there were subtitles for it. So what I'd do is I'd watch the episode once with the subtitles on, and then I'd cover up the subtitles and try and listen to just the Japanese to try and pick up, since I already knew what the meaning was, trying to pick up what was going on that way. Or I'd do it reverse. A lot of times I do it reverse. I'd just listen and see if I could pick anything up, and then I'd watch the subtitles later. It was fun, but it got boring after a while because I have to watch the same episode multiple times. And not only does Naruto really drag fights out, but having to watch that fight double twice means that it was taking double the time. So I got bored pretty fast, but it was helpful. I did learn a lot. What I do now is I would do actually more of the same. I'd watch a lot of dramas. I'd do the subs on, subs off thing for various different shows. But what I'd also do is I'd use some tool like maybe Language Reactor. It's a tool where basically you can use it on Netflix or maybe YouTube as well. And if there's subtitles available, you can click on the words that you don't know and it will give you a meaning. And I think you can even make flashcards from them. So something like that would be very, very helpful. If I was starting out now as a new student, I would definitely be using that. I don't use it now because I don't need it, and it also breaks up the flow a little bit too much. But in the beginning, something like that would be really, really helpful. I also recommend using graded readers. I did actually use graded readers, but we'll get to that in the reading section a little bit later. But graded readers with audio can be very helpful because it's generally probably Japanese that you can sort of understand at whatever level you're at if you pick the right level. And you can just listen. Like, you don't have to read along. You could read along as well, but you could just listen first, and that can help with your listening as well. You can also use like variety show clips on YouTube or kids shows. There's lots of kids shows available on Netflix and on YouTube even. You can find episodes of things like Bluey. Maybe not on YouTube, but yeah, people like things like that. Shows for kids in Japanese can be very helpful for picking up simple Japanese as you go along. One important part when listening is that you should always try to relax a little bit and not try and pick up every single word. Because if you're trying to pick up every single word when you're listening to something, the moment you run into a word that you don't know, you're gonna get stuck and you're gonna miss all the words that come after it. So the most important thing when you're listening passively to Japanese or actively to Japanese even, is to just relax. And when you don't understand a word, just let it go and see if you can sort of figure out what's going on in general, just by listening to the whole thing going on. And a lot of times, even if you miss one word, you can generally get what's being talked about if you just relax and let the whole thing go by. If you focus on that one word, you're going to be stuck. Okay, the next important part I just mentioned was reading, step 6. In 2012, I was using graded readers, the Tadoku graded readers. They're a bit expensive, but that was all that was available at the time, so I was using them and I found them very interesting. The first time I ever cried reading a book was one of the level 4 graded readers, Tadoku graded readers. I don't remember what the story was about, but it was a sad story and very emotional. It was pretty cool. It was pretty cool to have like the first story that you read that ever made you brought a tear to my eye, being in my second language. So that was pretty cool. I also read a lot of blogs about new hobbies I was getting. I was getting into mountain climbing at the time, so I started reading about mountain climbing in Japanese when I was pretty low level, so I was having to look everything up. But what was happening is I was getting a lot of new vocabulary in Japanese that I didn't know in English because it was a completely new hobby. So that's a really cool experience to have, doing new hobbies in your new language. I also used a website called NHK News Web Easy. NHK is the National Broadcasting Association, I guess, here in Japan, and they have like easy versions of their news articles, some of their news articles every weekday, and you can click on the words within the articles to get meanings, and that can be very interesting. You can also click back to the original article to see how much harder like native Japanese is, the Japanese that is being written for natives is. So that can be really interesting as well. I found that quite helpful. What I do now if I was starting over in 2025 is honestly more of the same. I do a lot of the same. I would, first I'd install the add-on to Chrome, Yomitan. It used to be called Yomichan. I made a video on how to install that up here. It's still pretty much relevant, so it might be helpful. The instructions on the website are fine as well, but Yomitan, very helpful. It allows you to shift click on words on any website on the internet, and it will give you the meaning if you have a dictionary installed on it. There's a bunch of recommended dictionaries on their site, so it's pretty easy to use. I like to use now Japanese to Japanese dictionary, so it's just definitions in Japanese, but you can get any kind of dictionary you'd like, and honestly, a bunch of different languages, not just English. So I highly recommend having that for going forward if you're going to start learning Japanese. I would use more graded readers, like a lot more. There's a lot available these days. The Tadoku graded readers that I use are actually, a lot of them are available free on the Tadoku website, which I'll link to in the description. So you can read like hundreds of graded readers, or maybe like 100 for free on that site. Our website, tokiniani.com, we have over 100 stories that we've written along with audio. We have manga as well that we've been writing for people who are going through our course so that they should be able to understand pretty much everything. And if they don't, they can, ask us in the comments and we answer and help them through it and help them figure it out. So we have our website as well. There's lots of great material that is graded reading material out there nowadays. A lot of the graded readers you can buy are extremely expensive, so I don't necessarily recommend that for all of them, but you can get a lot more stuff than you could 13 years ago. When you get a little bit more advanced, like maybe post N4 level, I think that books aimed at elementary school students are really, really helpful. I even like to read books aimed at elementary, like upper elementary school students these days, like Majo no Takkyubin, that's Kiki's delivery service. I really like the Tsurubara Mura series, which is, there's 10 books based on, you basically just follow a person around in their profession in like a semi-magical version of Japan. Some of them are really, really fun, and they're a little bit easier than books aimed at adults because they only use certain kanji, probably ones you've studied up until that point if you're at N4 level, and somewhat simpler Japanese and sentence structure. So they can be really, really fun to read at my level because I don't really have to look anything up. And even at an N4 level, they could be approachable at least, as opposed to like a high level, quote, light novel. Light novels are not light as in easy. They're light as in they're basically written as if the author is imagining their book being turned into an anime. So they're light in terms of their content, not in terms of their Japanese. So books aimed at elementary school students are probably going to be much easier for people at that level. This isn't where you're going to be starting in the very beginning, but that's where you might end up. There's also some really great websites, like this website that is a lot of aspiring authors in Japan will put up their stories on this website. It's called Shousetsu o Yomo, so it's Let's Read Novels, and you can find hundreds, maybe even thousands of novels on there for free. In fact, one really popular light novel that is actually a published light novel now, Kuma Kuma Bea, is not very difficult, but it's available for free in its original form here on this website because that author started out here and was eventually found and became a published author. So you can read lots and lots of books, and if you combine it with that Yomitan add-on I mentioned before, you can learn a lot as you go through, and even create flashcards automatically by using that add-on. So websites like that can be great. You can also use games. Games are going to be really hard in the beginning, as is the novel and the elementary school books that I mentioned earlier. But games are going to be really tough in the beginning, but maybe after you finish like the first few levels of a grammar textbook or something, you might start finding them somewhat approachable. Games like Yokai Watch or Fantasy Life or even Animal Crossing, things like that might be somewhat approachable. But just keep in mind, it's going to be a struggle. Pokemon is also a good one, by the way, especially the newer ones, because they have furigana, which is phonetic readings above kanji. So they're a little bit easier to approach, but they will be tough in the beginning. So just keep that in mind. Speaking is also a very important part of Japanese. Eventually you're going to have to do it. I started from day one. I do have a secret, but we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. What I did in the beginning was I did a lot of shadowing. So basically shadowing is you listen to some Japanese and you try and repeat what you're hearing as you're hearing it, or just after hearing it, like immediately after hearing it, either way. I did a lot of that, which helped me get sort of a natural flow to my Japanese a lot better than if I was just reading sentences randomly. So shadowing can be a very useful tool. I also took Skype lessons. I guess you don't use Skype anymore, maybe Zoom or something, but there's a website called iTalki, and you can get Japanese tutors there. Most of them are paid, but still, they're not that expensive. So I used that a lot when I was starting out. I did a lot of Skype lessons. So on my iTalki lessons, one of the really important things I did was I asked the teachers to never use English, to please try and explain things to me in simple Japanese. And some teachers didn't like me for that, but it helped me learn a lot and get used to explaining myself in simple Japanese when I had complex terms to explain. So asking your teachers to not use English, it'll be a struggle, but it can be helpful. What I do now is I do exactly the same thing, like literally exactly the same thing. But there is that secret I mentioned, which we'll get to in a little bit. There's one thing that I didn't do when I started studying Japanese back in 2012 that I would definitely do now if I was starting today. So let's go ahead and talk about that. That thing is pitch accent. I did not learn about pitch accent when I started out. So what is pitch accent? Well, English is a stress accent language, which means that when we're adding an accent to a word, like I'm doing right now, we add emphasis. We stress the sound. We make it a little bit longer, or we make it a little bit louder. See what I'm doing there? That's a stress. I'm stressing the word. But pitch accent is not stress. Pitch accent is going up in vocal pitch, going up in, for example, like a low C and a high C on a keyboard, that's going up in pitch. So for example, if I were to take the word example, in English to stress it, I say example. I just go up in stress. I stress it a little bit more. But in Japanese, we might say example, example. So I'm not adding stress, I'm going up in pitch. Example. See what I'm doing there? So that's pitch accent. Japanese does not use stress accents. They use pitch accents. They go up in pitch. They come down in pitch on the stresses for each word. And that's something that I didn't know about back then. And why didn't I learn about it back in 2012? Well, none of the textbooks commonly available back in 2012 had anything about pitch accent in them. There was literally zero mention. And in fact, in most textbooks today, some are starting to add it. Most don't have anything about it. None of the teachers I was learning from mentioned anything about it. None of my friends mentioned anything about it. I knew nothing about it. Sometimes when I was out, I'd have a Japanese friend saying, "Can you hear the difference between hashi and hashi?" And I'd be like, I don't know. And I'd be like, "What are you talking about?" And they're like, "I don't know, but one means chopsticks and one means bridge." And it turns out they were talking about pitch accent, and they didn't even know that they were talking about pitch accent. So I just didn't know about it until around 2020 when I ran into a YouTuber called Dogen, who was basically making comedy videos, but his Japanese was so Japanese sounding. And I couldn't figure out why until he started making some videos about pitch accent. And that's when I learned what it was. And it was very interesting and also shocking because I realized I missed like a whole piece of Japanese when I started studying. And it was a little bit disappointing that I didn't know about it. But after that, I started studying it a bit more, and I used things like Dogen's Patreon and his videos on YouTube to learn a bit more about it. And I would definitely start doing that right away, just getting a feel for it. Even though it's not super important, there are more important things in Japanese than just pitch accent. Obviously, I got by perfectly fine for many years without knowing about it. Some of it I got down naturally, probably. But knowing about it a little bit in the beginning can help you sound a little bit more natural and probably make it easier as you go along. So I'd learn a little bit about it with, for example, Dogen's videos or his Patreon or his new app, Immerse, where you can record yourself and see how your speaking compares to native speakers' pitch. So something like that could be fun. I'd also, right now, I use the NHK Accent Dictionary, which is a dictionary that Japanese announcers, broadcasters, use when they're studying in broadcaster school because they need to have a standard pitch, because all over Japan there are different types of intonation, pitch, accent, depending on where you live, but there's a quote standard type of Japanese which has to be used on the news, and that has a standard pitch accent. So people have to learn about that, especially if they're not from one of the areas that uses that standard pitch. So I like to use that dictionary. I would get that early on if I was studying. I also use a website called Suzuki Tutor, made by, I think, a class at the University of Tokyo. You can put in whole sentences into Suzuki Tutor, and it will show you the pitch accent that should be expected for that sentence. I think that something like that would have been really useful when I was starting out. So checking that out for the sentences you're learning as you go along could be very helpful. So I have a secret that I mentioned earlier in this video, I think, and that is that I actually moved to Japan in 2012. I moved here, and that gave me some huge advantages. I had a lot more people I could potentially talk to. But the truth is, there are things you can do wherever you are to cover the differences. And just because you live in Japan doesn't mean you'll actually use Japanese. There are tons of people who live in Japan, and maybe they've lived here for 20 years and still can't speak a word of Japanese. It's wild to think about, but you can actually surround yourself by just people who speak your own language and just Japanese people who are interested in English or whatever your native language is, and never have to speak Japanese a day in your life, even though you live here. So just because you live in Japan doesn't mean you're gonna automatically get better at Japanese. For the first 6 months that I lived here, I studied no Japanese and did not get better at Japanese at all. So it's possible. It was after living here for 6 months that I realized that I should probably study a bit. But, you know, from that point when I decided to go hard, being in Japan did give me some advantages. But here are some things that you could do that could compare to what I did wherever you are in the world. So what I did things like I went to shops and I would ask where things were in the shops, just to get some practice. Like I could go look for them myself, but I would go out of my way to ask someone in the shop where it was just to practice. Or I'd go into small restaurants and I'd try and speak with the owners when there weren't many people there. So something you could do instead of that is you could, for example, get an iTalk tutor and roleplay with them. Of course it costs money, but it costs less money than moving to Japan. You could also record yourself playing both sides of a conversation, pretending to be a person in a convenience store or something like that. You could also use our website, ToKini and complete our challenges. We have lots of exercises, basically, where we will play one role and you can respond to our questions and things like that. So it's kind of like having a real conversation. Plus, we will correct your recordings and guide you in the right direction if you're making mistakes with pronunciation or just usage in general. So that's another option. Another thing I did is I would go out on the town and speak to people at bars and restaurants if they seemed receptive to that kind of thing. Of course, you might not be able to do that where you live right now, but you can do things like find a language exchange Discord and, speak half your native language and half Japanese with people from Japan on those Discord channels. I've never used one, but I hear there are a lot of them. So if you do a search in Discord, you can probably find some. Maybe someone can share in the comments ones that they use. One other fun thing I did was that I quit English for 1 month. Even people who didn't speak Japanese, I would only speak Japanese with them.
何ですかこれ?
What? You're hungry?
日本語喋れますか?
Sorry, we don't speak Japanese. No, sorry.
あれ日本語喋れなさそう.
And while you would expect people to really not like that, because we were living in Japan, what ended up happening was a lot of those people took it as an opportunity to learn a little Japanese themselves from me as I tried to explain with like gestures and stuff what I was trying to say. And I learned a lot in that month, and my Japanese got a lot more smooth because I wasn't using English, I wasn't consuming English media. I was just Japanese for a whole entire month outside of work because I used to teach English at the time. So I would be at work and I'd do my English lessons, and then outside the lessons, it was only Japanese. So what could you do? You could consume only Japanese content for a month, for example. Just turn off all the English music, TV, everything, throw it all out, put away your English books, just do Japanese for a month, and you'll be shocked how much you can learn. You could also, like I said earlier, check out a language exchange Discord or italki conversation lessons, and you'll learn a ton. So hopefully those tips give you an idea of where you can get started learning Japanese. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Share the video with anyone you think might be interested in learning Japanese. And if you're interested to see what it's like getting into endgame Japanese when you've gotten all this stuff down, check out this video.